lot of Terminator games have come and gone over the years. Some good, many not so good. A bit of an echo of the movies themselves. But the strategy and tactics genres had, up until now, remained uninfiltrated. Terminator Dark Fate Defiance is a 2024 real-time tactics game aiming to fill that gap in the lineup. But first, let's address the elephant in the room, the decision to use the Dark Fate timeline. At first glance, this might seem strange. Dark Fate was a box office bomb. The film did terribly financially and received mixed reviews, so why make a game based on that movie rather than some of the better Terminator movies? Well, the answer probably lies in the troubled development of the game and the can of worms waiting within. Dark Fate Defiance was originally announced in 2021 and pre-production allegedly started in 2019, not long after the Dark Fate movie was revealed. The original target release of the game was 2022. 2 years before the eventual actual launch. Officially, the game is both published and developed by Slytherin Software, but the real story is quite a bit messier than things would first appear. The actual development team, at least initially, was the Russian company Katsu Play, who had previously developed the somewhat notorious game Syrian Warfare, with which Dark Fate Defiance seems to share its engine and some gameplay features. And that was a game that had been criticised as being a pro-Russian, pro-Assad propaganda piece. At some point, Slytherin assumed control of development of Dark Fate Defiance, or at the very least scrubbed Katsu Play's label from the game. There has been speculation among some players that the development team's support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine is what caused Slytherin to quietly put a lid on them, and release the game without their direct mention. I won't go into it too much further because the real world politics of a studio is a little beyond the scope of this channel when it doesn't actually concern the content of a game, and because concrete information about the development situation is basically non-existent. But the timeline does seem to make sense in that context given that the game was originally set to release in 2022. But on the other hand, it seems just as likely that the game simply wasn't anywhere near finished and development had stalled, resulting in Slytherin taking a more hands-on approach. This is evidenced by the fact that the finished product is a little buggy and janky, so the state of the game around the original 2022 launch date was probably dire to say the least. It's more than likely that the real answer is perhaps a combination of these factors. With that out of the way, what is the game actually about? Dark Fate Defiance is telling the story of the origins of the human resistance seen in a Dark Fate future. The movie itself doesn't give us a whole lot to go on with regards to its version of that future war, so the game is essentially given carte blanche to fill in those gaps, and in doing so I think manages to salvage something quite interesting from an otherwise lesser installment in the long run in franchise. The player assumes command of the Founders, the remnants of the US military, against the advanced and murderous AI Legion, which is this timeline's equivalent of Skynet. Along the way you'll also enlist the aid of the Movement, which are an independent civilian resistance, as well as various other factions. You'll be doing a fair bit of interaction with other Judgment Day survivors, and these human interactions play just a bigger role in the game as fighting Legion itself. Early in the game, your group of Founders will face near annihilation, so it's up to the player to make decisions that forge the direction the survivors take, and in doing so potentially change the way your campaign develops, as well as the tactical opportunities afforded to you. The plot does end up weaving into the Dark Fate movie in some pretty major ways, although it takes quite a while to reach that point. But I'll delve more into the nitty gritty of the story later. For now, let's look at the gameplay. Dark Fate Defiance's gameplay is split between real-time tactics combat focusing on mid to large scale engagements and army management both on and off the battlefield. On the combat side of things, you'll be expected to master unit placement, combined arms warfare and matching units up against their optimal targets. This sometimes includes managing their use of different ammo types, as well as knowing when to fall back to lure enemies into positions more favourable to the player. The game can be pretty micro-intensive at times, and you're given the option to pause the action to assess things and give orders. I'd say it kind of falls somewhere between World in Conflict and Men of War in terms of gameplay. Early on, a unit loss is a pretty big deal, so paying attention to what your forces are doing is a crucial element of the game. That brings in the first layer of army management, fuel and ammo. Both of these resources get consumed by unit actions. It's pretty self-explanatory. Vehicle movement consumes their fuel, and units firing their weapon expends ammo. Support vehicles are available to replenish these in mission, but they must be safeguarded. Infantry can also replenish ammo from vehicles with passenger slots, such as APCs, as long as the vehicle is stocked up, of course. Fuel and ammo are both persistent resources too, meaning that if a unit ends a mission with no ammo, it will remain that way until you replenish it. Your army being a constant entity is a core feature of the game. Every unit in your army is persistent. If you salvage a tank at the start of the game, you can potentially keep it all the way to the end, provided it doesn't get destroyed. Bringing messed up units back to strength can be costly, and the early game can be a real balancing act. Attrition is real, and throwing away units willy-nilly can absolutely be a game ender. The other major resource the player has to be aware of is supply points. Moving on the overworld consumes supply, and every unit has different levels of supply required per day. Your natural instinct will be to build the biggest army possible, but this isn't always something you want. Doing so might end up with your force consuming too much supply to be sustainable, and this was a trap I absolutely fell into a couple of times. This is even a mechanic that can potentially softlock you if you have exceptionally poor supply management. While it seems like that's obviously an intentionally designed pitfall that you can run into, I think some players would probably just find that frustrating. Supply is also used to repair and rearm units between missions, so again it's a balancing act. It's all well and good having enough supply to progress, but you ideally want a surplus of it in order to keep your force in fighting shape. You can turn up to a mission with 10 tanks, but they won't make a difference if they're all out of ammo and have damaged armor. Between missions, units can also be upgraded with things like new weapons and armor plating, as well as gaining levels which gives them the ability to buy perks. For example, armoured vehicles can go from using their real-world armaments to being equipped with Legion plasma cannons. Similarly, infantry can swap out their pea shooters for plasma rifles if you get the opportunity. In a pinch, infantry can also swap certain heavy weapons in the field, so if you run out of ammo you can order them to pick up a similar weapon, which is particularly useful when it comes to things like rockets and RPGs. Perhaps my favourite part of the army management aspect of the game is acquiring new units though. More specifically, vehicles. During firefights, enemies may abandon damaged vehicles, or you may come across abandoned vehicles already on the map. Crew and engineer class infantry, as well as a couple of other specialist types, can hop into abandoned vehicles to claim them as your own. This allows you to build up a hodgepodge of units and keeps your army lineup both flexible and interesting. It actually reminded me a little bit of Heroes of Might and Magic, with the way your late game army usually ends up being a mix of different faction stuff. I will say that between managing the army and unit losses potentially being a big deal in the first half of the game, I did save scum a lot, although maybe that says more about me and my skill level than it does about the game itself. It does feel like the game screws you over sometimes though, throwing ambushes of powerful units that you have little room to react to. Sometimes your prized vehicle formation will just go up in smoke because you triggered a wave of anti-tank arseholes out of nowhere. In some missions it starts to feel more like a puzzle game with how precise your actions must be. Plus, without your constant attention, some units will make boneheaded decisions when it comes to weapon and target selection, such as tanks wasting ammo for their main guns on small infantry units out in the open rather than using their machine guns. So sometimes you really need to be manually banning them from using those weapon types. The stealth mechanic also seemed to be somewhat broken in my experience. You can change the rules of engagement for a unit. Attack but not pursue, attack and pursue, and finally to ambush mode, which states that units will not attack unless they've been spotted or an enemy is within a certain distance. This last mode felt like a coin toss every time I tried to use it to its stated effect, with units randomly opening fire even at long distances and seemingly without being spotted. Enemy artillery in particular can feel like total bullshit sometimes. They can lock down a good half of the map and seem to track units nearly perfectly. You'd assume that using fast units like technicals to outrun their fire in order to get close and take them out would be an ideal tactic, but they lead their shells too well and can often shred those units before they even lay eyes on the artillery piece. The only real tactic I could effectively employ was to use more heavily armoured units as a distraction, often sacrificially, while I move in several other units to take out the arty. In one mission, there's callouts for when the enemy artillery is retreating to resupply ammunition, which is your window to press the attack.
Why had artillery stopped? Must be getting more ammo. If we're gonna do something, we should do it now.
If other missions had explicit rules around enemy artillery like that, it would be more tolerable and encourage actual tactical gameplay. But in the majority of the missions, they just sit there oppressing your units with impunity until you either take them out or they run out of ammo.
You see, killbots have a preset kill limit. Knowing their weakness, I sent wave after wave of my own men at them until they reached their limit and shut down.
At this point, it might also be worth mentioning that about halfway through recording my playthrough, there was a big balance patch that made the game slightly easier in general by improving vehicle resistance to damage some changes to various missions to reduce overall difficulty, as well as making it clear that the lowest difficulty setting is actually normal difficulty. I'm playing on medium difficulty, which was the previous normal difficulty. So with this in mind, the earlier game is perhaps easier now than when I initially played through it. As mentioned earlier, Dark Fate Defiance features an overworld map that the player's army traverses in between real-time missions. This overworld is where you'll manage your army, trade with the various other factions for resources and units, and receive new missions. Additionally, you'll occasionally be presented with choices here too. These include opening shortcuts, getting information about potential side objectives, and sometimes even entire optional missions. For example, at one point I was presented with an option to take some bridges from an enemy faction before they could blow them up, or avoid them and spend an extra day's worth of supplies. This ended up being something worth doing because if you play your cards right, you can leave the mission with more equipment than you went in with. There was also a sub-objective in this mission which netted me a whole heap of advanced weaponry which would have been expensive to purchase, as well as some good vehicles abandoned in the environment which I was able to capture and restore. It turns out there's a whole lot of choices in the game that I wasn't even initially aware of. The first real mission you're presented with after the introductory tutorial levels is actually one of the most important missions in the game. Choices you make at this early stage will come back later in ways you might not even notice on your first playthrough, potentially even altering the final mission. It's also possible to lose important hero units, or never even recruit them in the first place, which can lock you out of different ways to approach later levels, and means that some unique dialogue won't be heard.
You did it! You saved my friends. Now I'll make good on my promise and join your force.
The more open-ended missions like that are where the game really shines, and perhaps most interestingly, there are a couple that even take on a more role-playing game kind of guise. In particular, one mission sees you infiltrating a town run by a drug cartel. The protagonist must earn the trust of the cartel while simultaneously sabotaging their operations and instigating a rebellion. You're given multiple avenues to pursue here and are given a bunch of side quests to undertake in order to help you later in the mission. It even features a unique kind of currency only used in this mission.
Order is 21 pesos.
This mission and a similar one later in the game are very dense and shake the game up in an interesting way, and they do so pretty organically too. Having a more RPG style experience in the mix alongside the bigger battles just feels right. On the flip side, however, I think some of the missions revolving around defending areas can go on a little too long. The game is sort of front-loaded with these kinds of missions, and again it's an exercise in attrition more than anything, although I suppose it does reinforce the sense that the machines are this unstoppable onslaught that will never stop attacking.
It can't be bargained with, it can't be reasoned with, it doesn't feel pity, or remorse, or fear, and it absolutely will not stop, ever, until you are dead.
Despite the flow of missions and the intermission map generally being fine, and despite really enjoying the smaller scale RPG style stuff, I kept having a nagging feeling that the game might have been more enjoyable if it was structured more like a conquest mode. Something more akin to Total War or Dawn of War Dark Crusade, where you're attacking and defending territory while building up your forces and supply networks. The overworld map is already there, it would just need a bit of fleshing out, and the army building mechanic would fit in perfectly fine as it is. I think this definitely could have been something cool to see as a more sandboxy kind of alternative mode at least. Something where you can mostly focus on building your army and fighting battles. There are three primary factions in the game: the Founders, the Movement, and Legion. The Founders can be considered the game's conventional army, being made up of remnants of the US military. Their lineup consists of elite units, typically with flexible loadouts, that can take on a multitude of threats. However, they're expensive to maintain and can be hard to replace if lost entirely. The Movement, on the other hand, are more of a guerrilla army, leaning more towards ambushes and hit and run. Their playstyle is actually reminiscent of the future war scenes from the original Terminator movie, which I'm sure is not accidental. The Movement utterly lacks any sort of heavy armour, however, but make up for it with their gun platforms, which are defensive emplacements that have some very powerful weapon options and can be quickly relocated using their various technicals. Legion is not playable in the campaign, except for occasional hacked units, and unsurprisingly serves as the main opposing faction. Their units tend to be slow but heavily armed and armoured. The Dark Fate movie didn't give much to go off of in terms of Legion's full arsenal, so their unit roster in the game is almost entirely new stuff not seen in the movie. Legion is never going to be as iconic as Skynet. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it never features in any Terminator movies again, although I think they should just stop making them altogether, but that's a different matter. But Legion's lineup here is passable. I particularly like the Terminator dogs and the walking hexapod artillery. In addition to the three main factions, there's a handful of minor factions too. Bandits, the cartel, and the integrators add some human enemies into the mix. You'll also have the opportunity to take on some of their units either through capturing vehicles or, rarely, outright hiring certain units. Bandits are pretty straightforward and don't really have much going on. They're occasional adversaries and their infantry is generally just worse versions of other factions' soldiers, while their vehicles are mostly reused movement technicals. The cartel is a drug cartel that rose to power in Mexico and the southern US following Judgment Day. More on that later. And their units are a mix of cannon fodder and specialists mirroring other factions. They can bring more firepower than bandits, and their vehicles have a unique heavy armour that offers more protection than any other armour available for those units, while also slowing them down considerably in return. They also field a unique light tank not seen anywhere else in the game. The integrators are perhaps the most interesting of the three independent factions. In fact, I'd say they're the most interesting faction in the whole game. The integrators are humans that decided that in order to survive in a machine world, they must become like machines. They're experts at scavenging and repurposing Legion technology, and measure others' worth in terms of pragmatic usefulness. Their units are highly skilled and wield powerful weapons, and look dope as fuck to boot. While their use of technicals might be deceptive, they're actually heavily armed and armoured, and are a massive step up from the movement technicals you'll be accustomed to. Integrator units are very strange, however. While it is possible to capture their vehicles, they use a prohibitively large amount of supply per day that makes taking even a couple of them entirely unviable. This is disappointing because obtaining them is an uncommon occurrence and they have the best unit designs in the game. Additionally, they can't be refueled in mission for some reason. I did however manage to scrape supplies enough to be able to use a bunch of their units in the final mission, which is possible if you make a decision to double cross the integrators. Thankfully, their possible support in the campaign is limited to a special selection of trade items if you're on their good side. So if you're going the min-max route, betraying them before the final mission is a no-brainer. The human factions generally have access to the same arsenal of weapon types and upgrades. These start at real-world weapons such as M4s and RPGs for infantry, mounted Brownings and recoilless rifles for light vehicles, and so on. Eventually these progress to more advanced weapons like the NGSW, S-RAWs and TOW launchers. Finally, you'll get access to advanced Legion plasma weapons. Vehicle armour progresses similarly, starting with ad hoc cope cages and ending at advanced ceramics. While plasma weapons do more damage, they usually have a shorter range than conventional weapons and use a lot of ammo resources to rearm. I actually ended up keeping my regular infantry largely armed with lead spewers because the range trade-off just wasn't working for me. A super duper minor complaint I have here is that there should have been Uzis and Spaz 12s as weapon options for certain units. It would have been a nice reference to Terminator 1 and could have filled a slight gap in those weapon classes which are lacking compared to other types of weapons.
You can't do that.
While I think the faction lineup is decent, I wouldn't be adverse to an update or even DLC containing classic Skynet and TechCom factions. Even if they're only for multiplayer and skirmish, it'd still be nice to see. Skynet in particular has such an extensive unit list to pull from, both from the movies and also all of the secondary media made over the years. On the subject of multiplayer and skirmish, the game has both. Barely. Upon launch, the game had a measly 4 skirmish and multiplayer maps, all of which are recycled campaign maps. The maps are also locked to specific modes, those being a traditional mode focused around taking and holding points around the map, and a mode that progresses in a linear fashion with teams split between attacking forces and defending forces. Over the course of my playthrough there was an update that added a couple more maps however, along with a new scavenging focused game mode exclusive to multiplayer. The future plans for the game do include further skirmish and multiplayer updates. Without the persistent armies, supply management and upgrading mechanics found in the campaign, skirmish unit selection works a bit differently. Instead of being able to freely customize your units, you are instead presented with a set list of units with pre-selected loadouts. These all have various point costs and your starting army is pretty limited until you start taking zones around the map to get an income. I suppose doing it this way made balancing far easier, and it's hard to fault them for not having the full range of customization available in this mode given that monumental task. But it does mean there are a few unit variations that are not possible to use in skirmish and multiplayer. Furthermore, only the 3 main factions are represented in these modes. Bandit, Cartel and Integrator units are completely absent. Bandits I can kind of understand given how anemic and weak their unit lineup is, but the Cartel and especially the Integrators I think should have absolutely been playable here. Perhaps they would need a couple of units reused from other factions to fill in some blank slots in their rosters, but it would be doable. I hope this is something that eventually gets added in one of those planned updates. So let's get into the story some more. There will be heavy spoilers from here on out, so skip to this time code if you want to avoid them. Dark Fate Defiance's story begins shortly after Judgment Day in the ruins of Atlanta, where surviving elements of the US military are attempting to hold the line against legions. Here we're introduced to Officer Stevens, who still attempts to do cop stuff despite the ongoing apocalypse, because he's such a stand-up guy. Him and some of his buddies find an abandoned Humvee with a working radio and assume command over the military operations in the city, and rather than telling him to get the fuck out of their way, the military just follows him. Impressed with his composure, the ranking officer among the military forces takes him in.
It's all gone. I need people to help me build something new, better, more effective to replace it. You in, Stevens?
We then flash forward 10 years, where Stevens is now a major in the reorganised US military survivors, now known as the Founders, because that's how career paths work. We're then greeted by our actual protagonists, Alex Church and Sergeant Mason. Church is posted to a new command, while Mason has evidently been with his squad for quite some time, and is somewhat sceptical of the new guy in charge. So far, all of the characters are pretty cookie cutter. They aren't the worst thing ever, but they're fairly uninspired. Alex Church is the most generic dude guy, and the introduction of Stevens in the intro mission doesn't really work for me. It just comes across as stupid.
Who put you in command? The machines did, when they killed all of your officers.
Anyway, Church makes the decision to pursue investigations into Legion activity in the area, which reveals that they're taking captives, something that up until this point had been unheard of. Due to the raid on the convoy, however, Legion is able to track Church's force to their hidden command center in the Colorado mountains and launches a massive attack. This is also the first point in the story where the persistent army comes into play. In this defense mission, any unit you can save will carry over, including some hero units that absolutely can die here. The Colorado base falls, but Church buys some time for an evacuation. However, Major Stevens goes down with the ship, so to speak. With the loss of their base, their leader, and an untold number of troops, tensions flare between Church and Mason. Mason blames Church for leading Legion right to their doorstep, and his prior skepticism of the new guy seems to be justified in his eyes. The next mission is perhaps the most crucial in the game and offers many branching points. I won't go through them all, but suffice to say you can earn the trust of several groups here and, most importantly, have your first contact with the movement. Your choice here will determine their level of support for you in the next couple of missions, and if you choose to aid them in attacking Legion head-on, you can skip another defense mission entirely. There are also some lesser factions scattered throughout this mission, but the interactions with them here are also important and will have consequences further down the line. It's around this point in the game that the focus shifts a little, from directly dealing with Legion to dealing with various human factions in the post-Judgment Day world. Most notably, there's a large diversion in which you can aid the movement in the fight against the cartel down south. The cartel's leadership is in fact colluding with Legion. They provide Legion with captives, and Legion leaves their little empire alone. The finale to this subplot has you racing against Legion to assassinate the cartel's head honchos before they can be evacuated on board hunter-killer units, while also being defended by airdropped Rev 6 Terminators. It's definitely an extremely odd scenario for a Terminator game. This whole cartel storyline is rendered kind of moot, however. Almost immediately after finishing up this series of missions and moving on the overworld back towards your main goal, you're informed that Chihuahua, the seat of cartel power that you just liberated, has been utterly wiped out by Legion now that they have no use for it. Meaning, all of the people you just spent several long missions saving are now dead and your work was for nothing. Kind of a bummer.
Made it back, said the whole city was destroyed, with only machines left in the ruins.
Another noteworthy mission revolving around interhuman conflict happens in Vega, in which you encounter a group of Founders deserters attempting to fight off bandits, as well as a small but powerful force of integrators attempting to capture their leader. Much like the mission immediately following the destruction of the Colorado base, this is a mission thick with choices. When dealing with the integrators, you can attempt to fight them, but they pack a huge punch, so it's unwise. However, they give you an ultimatum to surrender their target to them, and you can use this time to attempt to prepare a defense. Alternatively, you can attempt to restore a powerful stolen integrator vehicle to use against them, but you're also given the option to barter the vehicle with the integrators in exchange for them leaving the area, with the downside obviously being that you lose access to a powerful unit.
You have acted wisely by returning it to us.
The end of this mission also makes you face a pivotal choice. A force of elite Founders units are hunting down the deserters you just saved. You can either side with them and assassinate the leader of the deserters, or against them and let him live. Letting him live has immediate benefits, but also consequences that will follow you for some time. From this interaction, it's clear the Founders aren't quite the saintly bulwarks of humanity that they first appear. The deserter claims that the reason their force abandoned the Founders was because Command used civilian family members as bait to draw Legion into an ambush at Oklahoma. It's also revealed that Church and his group are considered deserters as well, and that Major Stevens survived the Haven-based destruction and may still be alive to corroborate Church's version of events. Thus, they set out to finally conquer the Legion stronghold in Oklahoma to link back up with the Founders' command and clear their name. After taking the Legion base at Oklahoma, it's determined that Major Stevens and the other prisoners are likely being held at Fort Worth, and upon liberating them, Legion's true purpose for abducting humans is revealed: experimentation for the development of the next generation of Terminator units. 2 lines of research are discovered, one being infiltrators designed to pass for human, the classic kind of Terminator model. The other line of research is cybernetic enhancement of actual humans. This is where the game's story converges with the movie. Found that Command makes it a top priority to capture the cybernetic enhancement technology for use in their own soldiers. This is the same enhancement technology eventually used on the character Grace in the film. Before launching an assault on the Galveston factory housing these projects, however, a device to screen the Founders' actions from Legion must be obtained from the integrators. The integrators agree to trade their jamming device on the condition that you venture into a strange area that nobody returns from and Legion itself avoids. As it turns out, they're after a much better device called the Digital Storm that disrupts Legion protocols and sends machines haywire. The other option is to simply launch an attack against the integrators and steal their jammer. However, there's a third, more optimal, and more importantly, more fun route. This is where the option to betray them that I mentioned earlier comes in. Undertaking the mission to obtain the Digital Storm and then stealing it from the integrators anyway is the way that I did things, and I think it's well worth doing because the integrators camp is quite easy to attack and it's a pretty fun mission in a similar vein to the cartel infiltration earlier. Upon stealing the Digital Storm device for yourself, Church will comment that the integrators aren't even sure who created it, to which Mason asks if Legion itself built it. Church then states, "No, it's in a machine code but different to the one Legion uses. Could it be another neural network?" Which seems to indicate that Skynet might still exist in the Dark Fate timeline in some form or other. The final mission is fairly straightforward, but it's where a lot of decisions made throughout the game come to a head. This also marks the first use of infiltrator units in the Dark Fate timeline, as there's one guard in the final objective. He's actually extremely easy to destroy. When I encountered him, he was only armed with a pistol and bugged out and refused to even use it, so he was a sitting duck. Pretty disappointing. Upon completing your objective to retrieve Legion's research into cybernetic enhancement, Founder Command leaves Church and his force out to dry, while Legion reinforcements close in on them. Church and Mason decide to do the smart thing and destroy the factory with their final actions. However, at this point you can potentially receive a whole heap of reinforcements. People who you've aided throughout the campaign can show up to the fight to support you, providing you with a bunch of free units to help hold off the machines. In my run, I ended up getting a bunch of movement units, support from the Founders' deserters encountered in Vega, as well as help from the Founders' Ranger Battalion. I believe there's a couple of other characters that can throw their support in too, so that's a lot of potential fresh units. This was a really fun moment. All those choices made many hours ago having an impact on the final battle is nice, and feels like an earned, heroic final confrontation. But there's also potential to not receive any help depending on how you have played, which I think is also quite interesting in its own way. However, the finale feels very rushed. It's not absolutely terrible, the mission itself is pretty good and it wraps things up in the way you'd probably expect. They destroy the factory and everyone escapes by the skin of their teeth. There's a voiceover saying that this action was the beginning of real resistance to the machines, not mere survival. and then the credits roll. That resolution is fine, but the final cutscene only lasts roughly 30 seconds. It doesn't linger, and it doesn't elaborate on anything that happens between the end of the game and the brief glimpse of the future war in the Dark Fate movie. It feels very bare bones, and given the troubled development of the game, I can only assume they simply ran out of time or money to do something more impressive for their ending cutscene. Overall though, I quite liked the direction the story took. The large focus on the interactions between the various human factions is pretty interesting and a bit of a different take on the Terminator Future War. However, I think that might be a point of contention for some people and put them off. There's certainly an argument to be made that the war against the machines is the draw of the franchise. But for me personally, I think it was smart to try something a bit more varied.
We're not gonna make it, are we? People, I mean.
But while I liked that human conflict, the characters themselves were fairly boring and, ironically, mechanical. They're all generic dime a dozen archetypes, and I find it hard to really care about Church or Mason or any of the supporting cast, which kind of lets the campaign down a bit. Admittedly, I wasn't a fan of the movie the game is tied to, but I do think the way it eventually weaved into the backstory of one of the characters is quite neat, as well as serving as the introduction for the infiltrator units in this timeline. The potential implication of Skynet still existing is also incredibly interesting, and I think the fact that it's not something they dwell on really gets the imagination going. A conflict between two genocidal artificial intelligences could be a fun angle to explore. Of course, whether or not any of this is even considered canon is up in the air, and whether or not the Dark Fate timeline ever continues past that one movie is questionable. However, for what it's worth, I think this is actually a decent enough addition to Terminator canon. And it's certainly a better story and has better world building than some of the later movies, and that includes the one it's based on. The video and audio presentation of the game is mostly fairly standard, but there are a couple of hiccups. Neither aspect is amazing, but largely it's serviceable and I think is in line with the apparent budget level of the game. The game definitely has some cool particle effects. Destroyed vehicles look pretty good with smoke and flames billowing, and plasma fire is nice and distinctive. I just wish the wrecks stayed on the battlefield a little longer. Vehicle wrecks and battlefield debris fading away before your very eyes is a pet peeve of mine in games. Supreme Commander spoiled me, I think. Having hundreds of persistent wrecks on the battlefield at any given moment is peak Warzone aesthetic. I'd also like it if you could zoom in a little further to appreciate the models some more. Particularly the infantry, which just sort of turn into a vague human blob at the range the camera allows. Although they clearly have more detailed models than that would indicate, since you can see them in their portraits and in the encyclopedia. I do like that the infantry units in the prologue mission have unique US Army models not seen anywhere else. It's a small detail, but that's the kind of thing I like to see. I think some fans might be a bit disappointed by how unapocalyptic much of the game looks. The classic Future War scenes have such an awesome look to them and are striking even to this day. The dark urban rubble fields punctuated by plasma and searchlights from HKs is such an iconic visual. The game does feature this kind of thing, quite a lot of it in the latter half of the game where you're frequently in ruined cities in fact. But much of the first half of the game is rural US and Mexico where things are just kind of run down, but not overtly apocalyptic. It's also worth pointing out that there's a grand total of one radioactive crater in the game, and that's in the final mission. You don't really get a sense from some of the environments that Judgment Day was actually all that world ending. I do understand why they didn't just make the whole thing bleak urban battlefields with giant craters, however, as that would be pretty unexciting in terms of variety. But at the same time, I think it could have been pushed just a little bit harder when you did fight in those kinds of environments. Perhaps most importantly, however, is that the game is a little bit unstable. At certain times the game would drop frames massively and stutter, sometimes to the point that the game outright crashed. It seemed to mostly occur around Legion bases, and I suspect certain particle effects may have been the culprit. It's interesting to note that it only seemed to happen in longer play sessions too, so I'm wondering if it's perhaps some sort of memory leak.
Got trouble! Enemies located! They're swarming us!
On the audio side of things, the weapon sound effects and voiceovers are generally fine, but I have some issues with the mixing. Vehicles have very low audio for driving and idling and so on, even with the settings turned way up.
Major Stevens? Lieutenant Church. Sorry, my mind was wandering.
Your assortment of Mad Max mobiles racing across the deserts are barely audible. Even tanks struggle to make themselves heard.
Vehicle ready? Taking fire!
Also, while it's not strictly an audio issue in and of itself, the game has many translation issues scattered throughout. It's all incredibly minor stuff, and it never exactly made anything unreadable gibberish, but it was something that became very noticeable to me. But on the positive side, the music is pretty good. It can be a little different for the Terminator franchise, but overall decent, and it definitely fits the game extremely well. At times it reminded me of Tiberian Sun or Emperor Battle for Dune. Having a strategy game soundtrack compared to Frank Klepacki is a pretty good compliment. Terminator Dark Fate Defiance is certainly an interesting game if nothing else. The persistent army mechanics are pretty cool and offer both depth and a thematic sense of scraping the ruins of the old world to survive. So I'd call that successful execution. The spin it puts on the future war setting by having such a large focus on the human conflicts is also something very fresh for the franchise, and it does some neat things with the otherwise bland Dark Fate continuity. That said, it's far from a perfect game. Minor but pervasive flaws are present throughout, and the difficulty is perhaps not forgiven for newcomers to the genre. Plus, everything outside of the campaign is pretty bare bones. Sure, the campaign isn't without replayability, but if you just want to jump in and play some Skirmish, well, there's not much content for you there. There is more content for the game planned, however. As I mentioned, there was an update partway through recording this review that did add some more Skirmish and multiplayer stuff, and there's more planned if the roadmap they put out is to be believed. There's also a campaign DLC coming, which admittedly has me kind of interested, but in my opinion, with the weird shit show going on behind the scenes, the future of the game seems a bit murkier than what's advertised. Would I recommend the game? Well, it depends on who's asking. If you're confident with strategy and tactics games and want a predominantly single player experience, I think you'll probably like it, but it might not have the level of polish of some other games. If you're brand new to the genre, well, maybe not. Would a hardcore Terminator fan get anything out of this game? I think so. Admittedly, my love for the franchise drops pretty hard after the first two movies, but this is definitely a competent addition in its own right, as long as you can overlook the bland characters. And with that, this review has been terminated. Thanks for watching.